Hello. Even today, some skeptics stubbornly continue to discuss the supposed incompetence of Soviet military commanders during the initial period of the Great Patriotic War. They claim that practically all Red Army commanders were uneducated and cruel butchers who had absolutely no regard for the lives of ordinary soldiers and needlessly destroyed millions of human lives. Disputes on this topic can seemingly go on forever. However, in the Wehrmacht, the army of Hitler's Germany, there undoubtedly existed a high-ranking officer who was literally prepared to do anything to achieve his goals. We are talking, of course, about Ferdinand Schörner. This commander is a unique example of how one can rise from the ranks of an ordinary soldier to field marshal. However, a perfectly legitimate question arises. At what cost did he achieve such a dizzying climb up the career ladder? Origins: from private to field marshal. Background: Ferdinand Schörner was born in Munich on June 12, 1892. He became the last field marshal personally appointed by Adolf Hitler. He commanded army groups Center and North, playing a key role in operations on the Eastern Front. He was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, as well as a number of other awards and decorations of the Third Reich, which testifies to his high status in the military hierarchy. Ferdinand's father was a low-ranking police officer, and the Schörner family name had absolutely no aristocratic roots. For this reason, members of the military elite treated Schörner Jr. condescendingly, with obvious disdain, and tried to keep their distance from him. In turn, he envied and sincerely hated career Prussian aristocratic officers throughout his life, considering their privileged position undeserved. It was this hidden resentment and deeply rooted malice that ultimately made him a ruthless and cruel man. On the Eastern Front, Schörner systematically committed war crimes against civilians in the occupied territories. Moreover, the commander-in-chief did not spare the lives of German soldiers, often sacrificing them to achieve his goals. Eyewitness accounts, stories of cruelty and arbitrariness, numerous memoirs of veterans of the fighting in the Eastern European theater of war regularly contain extremely negative descriptions of Field Marshal Schörner. For example, the respected and authoritative Colonel General of the Mountain Troops, Eduard Dietl, was convinced that Schörner would have been much better suited to service in the military police, whose representatives were contemptuously and openly fearfully called chain dogs by ordinary soldiers. This opinion was extremely widespread among Wehrmacht soldiers, where the rank and file traditionally treated their commanders with great care and attention, evaluating their professional and human qualities. Another blatant example of Ferdinand's inhuman cruelty is the memoirs of the tank crewman Armin Bethge, who served in the 21st Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht. At the end of 1943, upon entering Nikopol, the tank crew, instead of the expected propaganda posters and slogans, saw numerous announcements on the city streets with sentences handed down personally by General Schörner. In particular, Armin read that some corporal, who for some reason had fallen behind his unit during battle, had been mercilessly sentenced to death. Further, he saw the sentence handed down to a German officer who had delivered much-needed mattresses to a warehouse. This officer was shot simply because, in Schörner's opinion, he could have brought ammunition, which was more important and necessary at that moment, instead of mattresses and so on. The list of such cruel and absurd sentences seemed endless. A non-commissioned officer who contracted a venereal disease while on leave received 20 years in prison. Schörner would promote or demote his personal driver, solely depending on how successful the trip with the general had been. A cavalry captain and his orderly, who had previously served in the cavalry and arrived at Schörner's headquarters on horseback, were sent to serve in the infantry, as he considered their appearance inappropriate. Schörner demonstratively ignored orders from his colleagues and even higher-ranking superiors. As an example, one can cite the case when Colonel Hans von Luck sent his sergeant to a rear repair shop to get damaged engineering equipment back into service as quickly as possible. Upon arriving at the workshop, the sergeant personally made sure that the repair work was in full swing and all the necessary vehicles would be fully repaired by morning. However, quite unexpectedly, representatives of the military police burst into the room where the sergeant was located and, on Schörner's direct orders, shot the officer on a trumped-up charge of desertion. Why are you sitting comfortably in the rear while brave German soldiers are risking their lives in fierce battles at the front? Present your orders immediately. My commander gave me this order verbally. That's what absolutely everyone says who tries to evade their deserved responsibility. In the name of the Führer and the authority vested in me as commander of Army Group Center, I sentence you to death for the proven fact of desertion. But this is simply unthinkable. I have spent the entire war from the very beginning until today at the front, constantly under enemy fire. Look at my awards. They are proof of my courage and devotion to duty. Your past services are of no interest to anyone. Now, when the situation has become particularly difficult and every soldier literally counts, you have decided to desert and shirk your duty. From the memoirs of the famous tank ace Hans von Luck, after the end of the war, while giving testimony, the Field Marshal cynically admitted that he had carried out absolutely any orders, even the most criminal and inhuman, without experiencing the slightest remorse. He was fanatically devoted to the ideas of National Socialism and unconditionally loyal to the Führer personally. Like the vast majority of Aryans at that time, he was deeply outraged by the conditions of the shameful Treaty of Versailles and passionately longed for revenge. The commander hated the whole world and openly declared that the NSDAP leadership never considered Italy and Japan to be its true, equal allies. The Italians, in his opinion, were too militarily weak and only hindered the establishment of complete German domination in the strategically important regions of Africa and the Balkans. And the Japanese, according to Schörner, had effectively forced Germany to abandon its planned intervention in China, which he perceived as a betrayal. Schörner, as a high-ranking general, often demonstrated a complete lack of understanding of the needs and problems of his troops at the front. He ruthlessly sent soldiers to certain death, forcing them to hold practically impregnable defensive positions despite enormous losses. Thus, Ferdinand effectively turned his tyranny into a kind of absolute law, always finding justification for his cruel actions in the supposed need to maintain strict discipline and order in the army. However, in May 1945, when Germany's defeat became inevitable, he cowardly betrayed his soldiers, abandoning them to their fate and fleeing to the Americans with the regimental funds. During the Soviet advance on Prague, Red Army tank crews destroyed a retreating column of German armored vehicles. In one of these vehicles was the commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal Schörner, who, fearing capture, fled secretly through the forest with his adjutant, disguised in traditional Bavarian costumes, towards the American occupation zone, abandoning his army to its fate. Commentary by Baranov, an expert of the Russian Military Historical Society. Sometimes the level of his hypocrisy is simply astonishing. After all, just a few weeks before his shameful flight, this same commander had mercilessly sentenced a huge number of his own soldiers to death for the slightest manifestation of cowardice. Fortunately, the field marshal's desertion so demoralized and undermined the morale of the German troops that the soldiers began to surrender en masse. This circumstance significantly helped the Red Army avoid significant losses during the final Prague operation. The inglorious end of the career of the monster in uniform. Soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht almost unanimously described Ferdinand Schörner as an extremely harsh, cruel, and merciless man, giving him the exceptionally apt nickname, Monster in Uniform. To maintain discipline and order in the troops under his command, he used the most draconian methods, so he was, naturally, not only feared, but also openly hated. A military tribunal eventually sentenced this war criminal to 25 years imprisonment. However, after serving only 9 years in prison, he was released early and returned to his native Munich in January 1955. Of course, from the standpoint of justice and retribution for the crimes committed, this was an unusually lenient and inadequate punishment for a war criminal of such magnitude. However, in his homeland, thanks to the widely known stories of Lieutenant General Oldwig von Natzmer, he was never able to wash away the stigma of shame. As a result, the former favorite of the Führer and once valiant commander became a universally recognized coward and a true outcast in the eyes of German society. Subsequently, Schörner's case again attracted interest at the initiative of the Soviet Union, but that is a completely different story that deserves separate consideration.